Video will take a look at answering this question by following an outline of Kenneth Sample's Chapter 7 of Without a Doubt, which is addressing the historical reliability of the Gospels. Sample's already made a case that we can trust the text of the Gospels that we have now, but just because we can trust the text does not mean that everything within it is true. And so first argument he makes and shares for that we can trust it to be facts is that because of the early emergence of the Gospels and the sources behind them, myths and legends did not have sufficient time to develop and be recorded in their accounts. And so Jesus died 30 to 33 AD. The Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, already existed by the early 60s. Pretty good stuff. Something that a lot of people point to as evidence of this is that the Synoptic Gospels there, they lack all of the important dates that occurred after, namely the destruction of the temple 70 AD, martyrdom of Paul, James, or Peter, or persecution under Nero. So because all of that's lacking in the Gospels, people would think that they were written definitely before these events took place. What bridges the gap? All right, so some people actually are then upset even with this idea that they came 30 to 40 years later. They still think too much time. They also ask questions like, why did they wait so long to write them? If this is true, why did they wait? Did they wait for others to die off so they could write this stuff? And the thing is that we actually have writings and other records that indicate that there wasn't this big lag in recording Jesus' life before the Gospels were written down. In fact, we know that the apostles, as soon as Jesus died, began to publicly preach. And so they were publicly preaching this message from his death until the Gospels were written. But then also, before the Gospels, we even have Paul's letters. All right? And so many of Paul's letters predate the Gospels. And with Paul's letter to the Corinthians, we have an early creed that is recorded in 1 Corinthians 15. If you're interested to know more about that, there are plenty of videos on YouTube that talk about the importance of this creed in terms of dating. But because Paul received this creed when he became a Christian, and we know he became a Christian pretty early on after the death and life of Jesus, but definitely before he wrote any of his letters, he would have received this creed. And so this creed must have been passed around even before he became a Christian. And so we know we had this early creed being passed around and taught amongst the Christians almost then immediately after the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so all of this bridges the gap between his death and the Gospels. So really a 30-year gap isn't significant. Some people may ask, why did they even wait that long? I speculate that why they waited that long is because they actually thought Jesus would have returned in their lifetime. That would be my guess. As well as, I guess, just the idea that they were preaching, they were spreading the gospel, and that it wasn't until they got later in age and realized, I think we should record this stuff down for other generations before they passed away. All right, 2, another argument. The theory that the Gospels are myths is only plausible if several generations existed in between the death of Jesus and the time they were written down. So this goes back to that first one, early emergence of when the Gospels were written. Even 30 years after, 40 years after, 50 years after is not enough time. All right, for legends to creep in. Legends can't replace facts so long as eyewitnesses remain alive. And so, example, September 11th, 2001, World Trade Center gets 2 planes crash into it, right, and they come tumbling down. Now, if someone tried to make claims right now, 20 years, or right now, like what, we're like 12, 13 years removed, and then someone 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, try to say that I was there, planes didn't hit the buildings at all, or I was there, one plane hit them, or I was there, this happened, and they start to make up things. Or if they try to say it never happened at all, we have tons of people that would still be alive that would be able to counter these claims. Same type thing would have taken place then with the gospel writers. If what they were writing was false, people like the Pharisees, the Sadducees, they still would have been alive, people that were actually there when these gospels were being written. And if what the gospel writers were saying was false, they could easily counter it. Other people, like the Romans, the governors, they would have had, if they were still weren't alive when the gospels were written, the people that knew them probably still would have been alive. So definitely, because the early emergence, there's enough eyewitnesses around. Right now I'm just listing people that would be considered enemies to the gospel writers, but even people that were friends, because Jesus had other disciples. Remember, at times he taught in front of crowds of 5,000 people or more. Okay? And he had, one time he even sent out 72 disciples. So he didn't just have 12 disciples. He had many disciples. And if what the gospel writers were saying was false or didn't accurately represent what Jesus said and did, any of the other disciples would have been able to refute those claims. And so friends and foes still would have been alive during the time the Gospels were written, which is why it's so important that they emerge so closely to the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So that is a key factor as to why legends can't replace facts as long as it's within a generation or two. Several generations have to have transpired before the accounts are first written down in order for legends to have possibly have crept in. In other words, there simply isn't enough time for them to be corrupted or to have legends. Third argument Kenneth Samples gives: the apostles recognized the difference between myth and fact, and because of this they made efforts to make claim that what they were writing was fact, which is pretty cool. So there's some verses that I got for that. A lot of them are saying, hey, we saw this with our own eyes. The one who writes this testifies of it, seen it firsthand. So that's all really good stuff. And that's actually the reason why the Gospels and the letters that we have in the New Testament are actually in the Bible. The canon would be like the accepted text, right? The standard accepted text that's considered to be the Bible. These are in there because they emerged from within the apostolic circle. We know the apostles were with Jesus the most. They were in his innermost circle of disciples. And what they wrote from firsthand experience. So therefore it can be trusted in a way that others wouldn't be trusted. Now, to prove that they actually wrote this stuff, we need to be able to argue that. Something that a lot of people now bring up is that Matthew didn't actually write Matthew, Mark didn't actually write Mark, Luke didn't write Luke. They don't actually say in any of their books, my name is John, and I was born at this time under this family, and I saw this, this, and this. So John doesn't actually say that. He refers to himself as the one Jesus loved, right? Or the disciple Jesus loved. So we don't have in there any actual account. And if you look at the top, the title of it, the Gospel according to John, that wasn't in any of the originals is what the people claim. But I would ask, how do you know that? We don't possess the originals. So there are a lot of arguments that have to go into actually proving that they wrote this stuff and were eyewitnesses. And one of these sources is Papias. He was the bishop of Hierapolis. We know that he was a disciple of John. This is what we have written down for us by Eusebius. Some people would argue that Eusebius is too late, too removed in order to be able to be accurate, but he's like third generation. All right. So yeah, I don't know. This stuff is it's very interesting how much people need in order to actually trust this. But for me, this is a really good quote passed on John to Papias, Papias to Eusebius. He says, so this is Papias' words recorded by Eusebius. The elder used to say this also. Mark, having been the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately all that he mentioned, whether sayings or doings. Hold on. All right, continuing where I left off, how to pause it. It says that Mark was neither a hearer nor a companion of the Lord, but afterwards, as I said, he accompanied Peter, who adapted his teachings as necessity required, not as though he were making a compilation of the sayings of the Lord. So then Mark made no mistake writing down in this way some things as he, Peter, mentioned them, for he paid attention to this one thing, not to omit anything that he had heard, not to include any false statement among them. So you've probably heard again and again, oh yeah, Mark is based on Peter's testimony. This is a source from within the 2nd century that we use to affirm that that is in fact the case. This is where we get this information from, because I know when you read the Gospel of Mark, it doesn't actually indicate in there anywhere exactly. This is Mark writing based on Peter. A quote from Irenaeus. He was a disciple of Polycarp, a disciple of John. So again, this is just this is like a 3rd generation Christian then. This is his quote. Matthew published his gospel among the Hebrews in their own tongue. Now that's pretty interesting. In their own tongue. So this would be Aramaic. So ultimately, Matthew published it in Aramaic. Maybe he first wrote it in Greek. Maybe he then wrote it in Aramaic. I don't know, but that's pretty interesting. I don't think we have any of the Aramaic copies surviving today. When Peter and Paul were preaching the gospel in Rome and founding the church there, after their departure, that is their death, which strong tradition places at the time of the Neronian persecution, 64 A.D., Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter himself, handed down to us in writing the substance of Peter's preaching. Luke, the follower of Paul, set down in a book the gospel preached by his teacher. Then John, the disciple of the Lord, who also leaned on his breast, this is a reference to John, and you got the verses there, himself produced his gospel while he was living at Ephesus in Asia. And so we got a whole listing there, who wrote what gospels, their names, what language they wrote, when they wrote it, who they wrote it to, and for what purpose. Really rad stuff all right there in this quote by Irenaeus. And again, this is coming from John to Polycarp to Irenaeus. Pretty good trail of information there. Irenaeus also said, so firm is the ground upon which these gospels rest, that the very heretics themselves bear witness to them. And starting from these documents, each of them endeavors to establish his own particular doctrine. Also, he said, for as there are 4 quarters of the world in which we live, and 4 universal winds, and as the church is dispersed over all the earth, and the gospel is the pillar of the church and the breath of life, so it is natural that it should have 4 pillars, breathing immortality from every quarter and kindling the life of men anew. Whence it is manifest that the Word, the architect of all things, who sits upon the cherubim and holds all things together, having been manifested to men, has given us this gospel in the fourfold form, but held together by one Spirit. Awesome stuff. All of this is good because it goes to show that there were only 4 gospels, that these 4 were accepted in use. There's no mention of any other gospels being accepted by the early church, by anyone in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, which is really good stuff for us. Tatian, AD 170, he organized the scriptures to put them in the first harmony of the Gospels called the Diatessaron. So he actually took the 4 Gospels and tried to compile them together to make one chronology, right? So where it's in proper order and like a timeline. Really good stuff there. This is 170 AD, again showing that the early church accepted who wrote these and that there were only 4 of them that they held to be authoritative biographies by these disciples. So all the other stuff you hear, Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Mary, and it's not reliable, never accepted in the early church. I'll skip that one. All right, there were other witnesses, both friend and foe, who could have refuted false claims. Already covered that a little bit. Nothing refutes or contradicts the claims of the Gospels. The apostles even called upon the testimony of others to be checked. So it's really cool when you look in the Bible, you see them calling out and saying, you saw this with your own eyes. He did this stuff amongst you. We did this stuff amongst you. What do you have to bring against us? What charge? And we got nothing saying that they were wrong in this stuff, or that what they're saying happened never happened, which is really good stuff. Another one is the type of writing themselves. When you read the Gospels, they're not written like Greek mythology. The miracles in Greek mythology are bizarre and frivolous. So think about the Greek gods. They pretty much acted like raging hormonal teenagers in the terms of the way they did stuff. You just wronged me, release the Kraken, and I'm going to wreak havoc because I'm upset, right? So it's kind of like Clash of the Titans status, mythology. And then when we get to Jesus, however, his miracles don't fit the typical form of Greek myths. They were always done in the context of history, in the context of his teachings, and were used to aid his teachings, which is really awesome stuff. And finally here, the arguments for rejecting the gospel claims are circular. Here's how it would work. The gospels can't be true because they say Jesus is God. Miracles are impossible. The gospels must be rejected as myth because of this. The gospels are myths because of miracles. We've come full circle, all right? And so it's basically a rejection of it because of the presupposition that miracles are impossible or that the supernatural does not exist, that all there is the material. And so if that's all you have to refute the Gospels is your premise, you are arguing in a circle and not providing adequate reasons not to trust them to be true. And so these are 6 options you can go with to help defend that we can trust what to be recorded in the Gospels to be fact and not myth.